And Clark County contracted with me to develop the literature review, and the documents that were produced are shown here on the screen. So as Julia mentioned, they're accessible to you. Just let us know if you don't have copies or if you have questions. We're happy to answer them. The 70-page literature review is shown on the right, and then there's an accompanying 2-page fact sheet. And I really want to thank Stefanie and the project team and so many other researchers and managers that have information that's incorporated into these review documents. There's a really nice wealth of information for us to move forward on. So starting with the goals of the literature review and our presentation today, first, summarizing desert tortoise habitat requirements and indicators of habitat quality. So what is our perception of what is a good quality desert tortoise habitat? And then moving into synthesizing restoration practices and in what situations different practices might be most applicable, might be most effective and cost effective as well. And then moving into providing cost estimates of the candidate restoration treatments and anticipating future changes and potential research needs. And just for a little bit of context, we'd like to draw your attention to the photo on the right-hand side of the screen, showing an unburned habitat on the left and a burned habitat on the right. And this was the burn edge, this was a huge burn. It was tens of thousands of acres up in the Gold Butte area. So a dramatic landscape change. And if we think about on the right-hand side, the habitat features, this has now lost a lot of the cover plants that are now missing, and that can affect tortoises by not enabling them to have cover during their daily activities, nor having cover plants in which to construct longer-term burrows. The fires might also have altered annual plant communities, so maybe have changed food plants for tortoises, and also maybe have altered soils, including soil chemistry, maybe even soil texture and structure, which could potentially even affect things like the stability of being able to dig in the soils for burrows. So it's these types of changes and disturbances in habitats in which we might be seeking to apply restoration to improve these conditions to replace missing elements of habitat that might benefit tortoises. And just some examples of desert tortoise natural history and biology and some of the implications of that for restoration. So first, just some examples here. Tortoises have long potential lifespans, and an implication of that for habitat restoration is that we might want to be looking at both short and long-term indicators of habitat quality and the effectiveness of our habitat actions to see how tortoises respond. So short-term indicators could be things like health measures, perhaps shell growth, for instance, and then longer-term habitat quality indicators could be the actual responses of tortoise population sizes. So, point being, we might want to be matching some of these indicators and tortoise responses to our habitat restoration actions across timescales. We maybe don't need to wait decades to actually see if our management actions are having a positive trajectory. And tortoises are sensitive to temperature extremes, and the habitat must offer protective structures, whether it's shrubs or geological features, for tortoises to seek refuge within during their daily activities, during the hot parts of the day, and then longer term for burrows during the dormant periods of tortoises. And so we can even do things like calculate which shrubs can provide enough shade to keep tortoise temperatures below lethal levels, for instance, and then tailor restoration actions around that information. Home range sizes and movements, we might be able to use some of this information then to tailor restoration treatments to optimize tortoise movements, for instance, by connecting pieces of habitat, maybe enabling through strategic restoration for tortoises to better utilize patches of habitat. And then some examples of habitat natural history features as they apply to restoration. focusing on the Mojave and Western Sonoran Desert, which is the range of the listed population of desert tortoises. This is generally a winter rainfall desert. And so typically if we're doing outplanting, for example, that we'll talk about later, typically one of the best times to do that is in November, December, to enable plants that are put out in the landscape to receive the autumn rains and then rains throughout the winter, assuming that that's a year that gets those rains, to enable them to develop root structures before the summer hits. And generally, we haven't had much luck with doing outplanting, for example, in February and March, because it's already getting too hot, not enough time for the plants to be receiving those winter rainfall events. And then fertile islands. These are shaded, nutrient-enriched locations, and these are a key part of desert habitats, and they're often need to be an initial restoration step where, again, we start providing the cover plants, and these shrubs oftentimes enable shaded locations, nutrient enriched, for annual plants to germinate. And one challenge that we face now is shown here in this example from Red Rock Canyon. This is an indigo bush, and then below it we see this fertile island effect. But unfortunately here, this is mostly red brome and cheatgrass that's growing below here. And so these are non-native grasses, poor forage quality for tortoises. And so we might be doing management actions here to try to enable native annual plants, which are the good forage plants. Generally, we'll talk about that later too, to benefit from these fertile island locations. And then as mentioned, non-native annual grasses are now, unfortunately, from a native plant perspective, a dominant feature of these deserts. And so many of our restoration actions need to be thinking about how our restoration treatments might be affecting the abundance of these non-native plants, and we might need to be pairing a lot of our restoration with treatments to reduce these non-native plants. And so, first question is, when might restoration be appropriate? And I teach a restoration ecology class at UNLV, and we dedicate a lot of time to this question because restoration is not necessarily always the most appropriate technique. In fact, sometimes management actions might just be more appropriate. For example, closing a road and letting natural recovery take place and not actually doing restoration, which can be very expensive and logistically complicated. So the first step is really identifying when is restoration the most important or the most appropriate management tool, and then what should we be restoring to, which again, we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But oftentimes recovery after disturbances are very slow in these deserts. This is a screenshot of a study that we just completed that involved 31 wildfires in desert tortoise habitat and had estimates of recovery of perennial plant cover ranging from 25 to perhaps over 50 years. And first of all, that alone is a long recovery debt where tortoises are not benefiting from the perennial plants. But more significantly is the cover is not necessarily being supplied by the original plants that were there before the burn or that are found on unburned areas. Generally, a lot of the recovering plants are smaller in stature and may not necessarily provide some of the same cover functions, nor those fertile island functions for tortoises. And indeed, and some of the estimates are that this actual species composition of these shrublands could require perhaps even 5 centuries, over 500 years to recover. And one example of this relatively slow recovery is shown here on the bottom. This is over 15 years after a burn, and we see there's some small creosote resprouts that are establishing here, but much lower perennial plant cover generally than is found in the adjacent unburned area. And it's these types of areas over here that might be really benefiting from restoration because clearly recovery is fairly slow. And in terms of development of the literature review, over 350 publications were reviewed that were dealing with desert tortoise biology and habitat needs. And then a systematic search was conducted to identify over 50 published restoration papers in the Mojave and Sonoran Desert, and augmented by unpublished information and agency information. And so we have a really developing and growing database of restoration literature to now draw from. So we're at the point of being able to identify some of the principles so far that all these studies have revealed, and then to also be identifying knowledge gaps on where we need to be going next. And just want to mention too that we're really viewing this as a continuous process, in that we're going to need to be continuing to have this type of research and adaptive management and ongoing generation of information, because treatments that maybe worked in the past might not work as well in the future. For example, a lot of the early research in Mojave Desert restoration was done in the 1970s, which was a much wetter time period than today. So perhaps treatments like seeding had a better chance of success during those time periods. And then today we can maybe still get some of those treatments to be effective, but we might need to be putting some variations on them. We'll show one example of that. So viewing this as an ongoing process to continue developing knowledge that can aid management and its cost effectiveness. And so now moving into the habitat requirements section. And again, this is just a very brief overview to give you a feel for what's in the literature review document and what types of information you can find there, while drawing in some of the examples of conclusions here into this very brief 25-30 minute presentation. So in the review, we categorized desert tortoise habitat requirements into 4 general categories: as cover, such as large shrubs below which tortoises can construct burrows, food plants, water, and safety. And safety being a general category that could involve things like ideally having low populations of common ravens that can predate on tortoises, ideally, for instance, low densities of roads to cut down on road mortality, and freedom of movement as well for tortoises. So for the first category, for cover plants, the literature has showed so far that generally tortoises are selecting the largest shrubs as temporary resting sites as they're moving around, particularly during the hot afternoon periods, and then as longer term locations to construct burrows, such as this burrow shown here below the shrub. This breakdown here, again, summarizes a couple studies that are developed in more detail in the literature review, but shows specifically the species that were preferentially selected by tortoises. And so we can begin using some of this information to identify, is our habitat, perhaps it's degraded, is our habitat missing some of these species? And then how can we potentially incorporate some of these larger shrubs into our restoration mixtures if restoring cover plants for tortoises is a goal? And then the other component of that is then how do we do that? What treatments are actually effective for these species? And the next category of forage and food plants, and just a couple examples here. The overwhelming conclusion thus far is that certain groups of native annual forbs are some of the most important forage plants that provide optimal nutrition for tortoises. A really neat study, graph here shown on the left from Jennings and Berry, a bite count study of tracking tortoises and seeing what they ate and identifying a series of, again, generally native annual forbs as being preferred. Some perennial forbs, such as globe mallow, some cacti, can be important forage as well, maybe particularly during dry years when there are few to no annual plants. And I'd like to also highlight a really neat study by Christina Drake, Todd Eskew, and collaborators, where they experimentally had juvenile tortoises in pens and then offered the tortoises different diets and then measured short-term responses of the juvenile tortoise health to these different diets. And again, it overwhelmingly showed that non-native annual grasses, in this case, red brome, was detrimental to juvenile tortoise health. And this is spectacular, really kind of cause and effect type of research, and then really provides a great baseline to then potentially begin applying this out in the field and seeing, can we actually link, if we can improve tortoise forage quality and quantity out in the field, whether that's at a restoration site where we're restoring it, or perhaps a fairly intact site, but where we're maybe then enhancing maybe some of these missing plants. Can we then see these types of responses, again, short and long term, in the tortoise population that's at these sites? And just want to mention just some of the challenges to habitat restoration in the desert. Clearly, this is a very challenging environment. And some of the challenges that we need to overcome include limited native plant material. Oftentimes, seed availability is limited. Judy Perkins and others will be talking about that during their sessions more, the rest of the workshop. And so we do have some options then to overcome that. For example, I'll talk a little bit about using cuttings, for example, that doesn't need to have native seed material. Certainly low and erratic precipitation. We'll talk about some treatments today and how to deal with that in terms of bet hedging and maybe incorporating some abiotic treatments that can be effective during times of very low precipitation. And then extreme herbivory. Will again show some of the effectiveness of some of these treatments that can help alleviate that. But despite these challenges, there are many examples now within that set of 50 published studies and other adaptive management projects that managers have conducted of at least partially successful restoration projects. And the table 3 here from the literature review shows 3 main categories of restoration treatments and 11 general treatments within them. And so the 3 categories, including revegetation, such as seeding, outplanting, environmental site restoration, such as topsoil salvage using vertical mulch. We'll talk about what that is later. And then restorative management actions, such as fencing and treating non-native plants. And I'm going to just show some examples of each of these treatments next. Again, don't have time to go through all of them in detail, but just giving you a flavor for what's available in the literature review and what we'll talk about in much more detail over the next couple days. So the first treatment being outplanting, and this is planting nursery propagated seedlings or cuttings at field sites. And the idea with this treatment is that native seed is in limited supply. And so we're trying to invest more per seedling to increase survival. So we're actually growing the plants in the greenhouse, enabling them to develop roots, and then planting them. So they're bypassing some of the very vulnerable stages in the field versus if we just do a direct seeding. Seeds then have to be retained on site, not eaten. They have to be able to then germinate, and then the seedlings have to survive and so forth. So generally, outplanting is more reliable than seeding, but it's not necessarily designed to cover large areas. So oftentimes we're seeking to revegetate small islands and strategically deploying it. And this is an example in Mojave Preserve. And they've just used just a couple dozen creosote outplants here to conceal the beginning of this road. And so think about the bang for the buck. If maybe 30 plants can result in forestalling further disturbance along this road corridor. This is another example on the bottom right. This is in a wildfire area, and just trying to get just some patches of native plants going, and then some seed production as well. And indeed, this creosote bush here in the shelter was already about 3 feet tall by 2 years and was already producing seed within the burn area. And here's some examples of some of the treatments that have been done to try to increase survival of outplants. And in total, 16 outplanting studies have assessed survival of at least 46 species for at least 1 year. And some of the top performers have included white burr sage, species of atriplex, creosote bush, and then yucca. And this is really important in that many of these, ambrosia is a little bit small, but many of the shrub species that have performed well in outplanting are some of those shrubs that are heavily utilized by tortoises for cover plants. And again, the literature review provides a full species list that might be a starting point for developing some of these species for restoration projects. And then this table summarizes some of the treatments and what they did in terms of increasing survival. And it's shown as a ratio here. And so in this particular study, providing plants with cages to protect them from herbivory, one example is here, just this mesh cage, increased outplant survival by 4 times relative to just planting without cages. And in fact, so far, really any of these caging or sheltering treatments have had greater positive influences on survival than even fully irrigating plants shown down here, where a lot of these actually like 1.0, that's neutral, that's no influence at all. Again, some of these sites, it can be hard to get enough water to some of these sites and so forth. So far, it doesn't mean that it's guaranteed that outplants will always work, but if we're providing them with some type of shelter and using good quality planting stock, and then maybe some type of irrigation, generally there can be some pretty good success, although we'll show an example here in a little bit of a total failure. But generally can be a fairly reliable method for restoration. And the next treatment is using revegetation treatment is using cuttings. And we can use cuttings from stems, branches, rhizomes, and roots. For example, there's even some donor plants at the Lake Mead Nursery in Southern Nevada that they keep just having cottonwood plants back there, for example, that just keep sending up shoots. And they can just keep cutting off some of those shoots and then using them and just taking the shoots out and then literally just planting the shoots and then they root. It doesn't work for all plants. But for plants that are capable of clonal reproduction, there can be a lot of advantages for that because we don't have to be constantly collecting seed. And just want to show one example of this from the Sonoran Desert. This was an area that had been strip mined about 50 years ago, and very harsh environment, almost no recovery here. And in this study, pads of Opuntia or beavertail cactus were cut off from donor plants and then actually just planted at these sites. And within 2 years, it was even already flowering. And again, this is just a first step in this very harsh environment to at least get some plants established. But it is significant because this can start drawing in pollinators. And again, cactus can be an important food plant for tortoises, especially during dry years. And in this case, planting the cacti around these protective rock shelters ended up doubling survival. And this is wonderful because it's a very cheap treatment. It only would take literally a minute or two to go collect some of these rocks and create those structures and then plant the cactus pads within that structure. And salvaging plants, there have been 3 studies that have assessed survival of a total of 44 species and have had pretty good success. And I'll talk about this a little bit in more detail in a couple slides here related to topsoil salvage. And then seeding. There have been a total of 13 studies that have examined 44 species, and the outcomes have been highly variable. There have been many successes, but then there have also been examples where the seedings have failed entirely. And maybe this isn't totally surprising because it can depend so much on seed quality and site conditions and rainfall. And I do want to show one example of what ended up being a very successful study from some of our own work, where it was designed to augment the availability of desert plantain, which is a native annual forb species and one of the important desert tortoise forage plants. And this was done at the Desert Tortoise large-scale translocation site on BLM land in Southern Nevada. And one of the main features of this study was that pelletizing seed, that's all this white-coated seed shown here, in basically a food starch grade type of material. It ended up being extremely effective, really tripling, quadrupling in some cases, the cover and also the density of plantain for at least 2 years. And so very successful effort at augmenting the availability of this forage plant. We have gone back and revisited these sites. We haven't analyzed those data, but we'll be able to see now 6 to 7 years after the treatment if there's a persistent effect, which would be really, really neat. And there might be, because this has been a potentially huge replenishment event of the seed banks, where restoration has enabled the plantain to develop pretty large seed banks so that it's available to germinate during favorable years. Assisted natural regeneration is another treatment, and this can help organisms, in our case, your plants, overcome barriers to regeneration. And an example is that on sites like this, we can have big flushes of seedlings some years. And that's pretty common in the Mojave and Sonoran Desert, where there might be mass germination of creosote, burr sage, other shrub species, and it's just like almost like carpets of seedlings. But then the next year you go back and maybe nearly all of those seedlings then end up dying. And so with assisted natural regeneration, the question is, can we identify these seedlings and then do treatments to them to promote their survival and basically have just facilitate nature, where we don't then have to go out, collect seed, we don't have to grow plants in the greenhouse. We're just really trying to enhance the germination on site and survival of plants on site, with the advantage then that those are likely, of course, local genetics. And this particular study had pretty mixed results. Honestly, the shelters were applied, and then a slow release irrigation was also applied, and it did enhance growth, but did not necessarily enhance survival of the seedlings. This is one that did very well, that grew, really tripled in height over the study of 2 years. But really the overall conclusion was that this method has potential, but we really maybe need to see other species and see their amenability, and also test other treatments as well. But again, just to give you a feel, this is the only study that we're aware of that has looked at this yet in the Mojave, Western Sonoran. So we might need quite a bit more research to potentially develop this as a reliable technique for managers. And then environmental site restoration, the second category. And this is using abiotic treatments to try to improve habitat features, both directly for tortoises, and then maybe also using these abiotic treatments to try to stimulate natural revegetation. And this is an example from near the Chuckwalla Critical Habitat Unit, just south of Joshua Tree National Park. And the study used vertical mulch, which is basically planting dead plant material. A lot of times it's woody branches, such as from creosote. In this case, it's dead stems that were collected from nearby of big grass, and then actually just planted in the ground to try to simulate the structure of a native plant. And again, this was a pretty harsh environment. There was almost no plants whatsoever on these sites. And so it's just trying to get some vegetative cover back. And it was a bet hedging project in that both abiotic treatments and outplanting treatments were both applied. And that was a really good idea, because it turned out that the study occurred during the driest period in the last 47 years. And as a result, all of the outplants ended up dying. However, the abiotic treatments performed quite well during this dry period. For example, this graph here shows soil accumulation, and the vertical mulch actually, not only did it fully stop soil erosion at the site, which is a huge problem, there's all kinds of sand erosion down there. Not only did it stop soil erosion, it actually resulted in local soil accumulation at those locations. And it also even facilitated some shrub seedlings to appear within those vertical mulch structures. And we'll need to, of course, follow and see if those end up surviving. But a good example of a bet hedging approach, where applying the very cheap, comparatively cheap abiotic treatments ended up doing very well, and the more expensive outplanting treatment ended up failing entirely. And so this might be something that we're going to need to consider more and more, as we're having more and more potentially suboptimal years that are warmer and drier, in which to actually be doing restoration. And if we then have some of these abiotic structures that are out on the landscape, they're then available to provide functions during these dry years, but also available then to promote recovery if there are some of these wet years. And so we're not going to be having to time our restoration activities perfectly. And then the next example is salvaging topsoil and reapplying it. And this is not always feasible to do, but a study from Lake Mead National Recreation Area showed that when we can do it, it can be extremely effective. And indeed, it was combined with salvaging plants too. It was a road construction project, and so plants were able to be salvaged before construction and then housed for a year in a temporary nursery. This is one of the nurseries. And then once construction was done, then redeployed out on the landscape. And this is one of the example sites. There were dozens of sites along the road. And some of the species performed very well, again, summarized here in this table. And the key take home was that outplanting on salvaged topsoil was nearly equivalent to planting non-salvaged topsoil and fully irrigating. And so it really illustrated a trade-off for management in that doing the salvaged topsoil and storing it and then reapplying it is a major upfront effort, but then we might be saving costs later where we're having to do less maintenance. We're not having to do as much irrigation. We were really pretty amazed that putting the plants on the salvaged topsoil had basically the same performance as if we fully irrigated the plants. And this is another example of one of the salvaged topsoil sites. In this case, it had pretty good just natural recovery, maybe just some of the seeds from the seed bank germinating and retention of organic matter and soil microorganisms. And just wanted to show a very useful study by Sarah and Leslie, where they examined optimal ways to store topsoil, ideally storing topsoil for shorter periods of time, so the materials in it doesn't degrade. It doesn't become like a compost pile where these materials are decomposing. And then their paper here showed that the importance of optimal techniques, such as ideally just salvaging, if we have a choice, just salvaging the upper layers, because that's where a lot of the seeds and biological material are most concentrated. So it's a big effort, but there maybe are ways that we can optimize it to cut down on the amount of effort that's involved. And then a next technique is restoring certain soil features, such as biocrusts. And there's a lot of research that's ongoing to cultivate biocrust organisms like lichens and mosses, and even develop slurries and other treatments to apply these organisms out in the field. And in this case here, Lindsay Chacoin did a master's thesis at UNLV, and she was looking at salvaging biocrusts and then reapplying them. And again, they were extremely harsh environments. This is the totally denuded site. And then this is 7 years later after there was extensive recontouring, but appreciable natural recovery through these treatments. Some of these are outplanted plants as well, almost unrecognizable here. And in terms of the effects of the biocrust inoculation, she found that applying biocrust, again, to this very severely disturbed environment resulted in a major improvement in soil stability, almost improving the soil stability to the level that was found on the reference sites. This is almost a magical set of findings here. And indeed, she also found that it improved lichen cover, not quite to the level of the reference undisturbed sites, but a substantial improvement. And then also substantially improved the cyanobacteria, which are very important parts of the crust as well. And the topsoil salvaging, again, did a really good job at that as well. But just taking the organisms and applying them to even the non-salvaged topsoil areas had big benefits as well. So a lot of potential for this. And why does it matter? First of all, the biocrusts can be important harbors of biodiversity themselves. There's an incredible diversity of lichens, mosses, and microorganisms that are in these crusts. but also the soil stability functions, so we don't get erosion, we're not losing further soil and all the nutrients and organic matter. Even things like, if it is a polluted site, for example, keeping that pollution that's in the soil and not then exposing tortoises to some of those pollutants. And that's another thing that I didn't mention in terms of the safety of tortoise habitats. Pollution can be another key factor because that's been tied. Factors like elevated mercury and other metals, for example, have been tied to deteriorating health in tortoises. And so this is one of those types of treatments that we can potentially use to cut down on that dust generation and pollution. And then a couple examples here of restorative management actions here to finish up. One example being fencing, this was an example from the Desert Tortoise Research Natural Area, where tortoises were 2.5 times greater inside the fence. So this, is potentially an actual population increase response, potentially within the natural area from long-term protection. And it's linked, such as a study here by Matt Brooks, to potentially improve forage inside the fenced areas, in addition to reduce disturbance. And then here's a summary of some of the costs and logistics, with restoration costs varying widely. We might have a very expensive model where it's over $100,000 for 2.5 acres. And that might come into play, for example, if there's legal settlements. We've helped the Park Service, for instance, develop some of these cost estimates for things like arson fires, where maybe there would be funding for full habitat reconstruction or attempted reconstruction. But generally, restoration costs can be much cheaper, $1,000 or so for 2.5 acres, or even potentially as volunteer projects as well. And again, this is an example of ripping a road here before and after. A one-time treatment, there might be costs to that, but maybe can foster plant recovery. And then in closing, some ideas for anticipated future changes and research needs. First, the desert tortoise is an interesting situation in that it faces a series of multiple interacting stressors at the landscape scale. And there's been huge progress that has been made in tortoise recovery efforts. For example, trying to reduce competition between livestock and feral burros and horses for the food plants, because all these animals a lot of times focus on some of the same food plants, like those annual forbs. And so that's been a huge progress across much of the tortoise range. But maybe that alone, maybe we're going to need to then pair that with, for example, treatments to reduce non-native plants. Because, again, maybe we reduce livestock, but we have a landscape that's still dominated by non-native plants. And so then we might need to be addressing that as a stressor. And in my view, the treatments for non-native grasses continue to be one of the most important research needs. And one, just a guess, is that we're really going to need probably dozens of studies to really understand which treatments are going to have the least non-target effects that aren't going to wipe out native grasses, for example, which are actually agreeable, if we're talking about using herbicides and so forth. And then what's the timing? How can we optimize timing to maximize treatment effectiveness while maybe even trying to not do these things while tortoises are active? And so, just this brief, 20 seconds of mentioning some of those factors, we have so many combinations that we're going to need to try across these different site conditions as well. That, in my opinion, I just feel that that's a primary research need. And then we might also envision that habitat restoration might be all the more important during a changing climate. Again, for example, here, before burn, after burn, loss of these cover plants. As conditions become warmer and drier, we might want to do restoration all the more to get those cover plants back, so that tortoises have protection during warm conditions. Another example being, if we have a landscape that's dominated by non-native plants, native annual forbs then might not even germinate due to competition. They might not even germinate. during marginal climatic years, which there might be, more of those going into the future. And so imagine if we could get some of those native annual forbs to be present more years than they would otherwise not be because of contemporary changes in landscape, and have them available as food plants for tortoises. Imagine what that could potentially do for tortoise nutrition and populations. And then this idea of linking habitat restoration with tortoise indicators, I feel that this is a great opportunity for collaboration between plant ecologists, habitat folks, and tortoise biologists to be able to take all of this information that the community has collectively developed on tortoise biology and habitat restoration, and begin merging these and see what actually happens then if we apply these treatments out in the field. We can certainly measure the plants and soils and so forth, but then can we actually be measuring responses in tortoises themselves? And so this is a potentially great timing now to take advantage of all of this prior work in moving forward. And with that, I'd like to thank you for being here today. And I think we're ready to move on to the next section.